Hello my creative friends, it's time to take another art break, and today we're going to be working on this sweet little mouse. Now she was painted mostly in watercolor, but the background I used some water-based gouache in the background. Now I'm pretty new to using gouache and I've mostly just used it to add accents here and there, but today I wanted to try it on the background. And with this painting I kind of did a little bit of a mistake. I was getting way too pink and I needed to switch it, but because I was using gouache I could add a few more layers. So I'm excited to show you how you can use gouache with your paintings as well. I'm a mixed media artist at heart, so I love combining the two materials together, and I'm learning a little bit more each time I use it. For those of you who'd like to paint along with me, but drawing's not your thing, I do have a sketchbook membership. That's where I have all of the line drawings for any of the paintings I do on my channel. You can just scan that QR code. It'll take you right over there. It's very reasonably priced, and I so appreciate all those who support my channel that way. Thank you so much for doing so. Well, let's grab your art things and sit down and relax, and let's see how my oopsie mistake actually turned into a quite pretty background. The paper I'm using is the Canson XL watercolor paper in 140 pound, and then I'm just using a couple watercolor sets that I have. I always say just spend a little bit more money on your watercolor paper and just use whatever paint you might have. After I had traced my little image onto my watercolor paper, I used a light box for this. I always draw my drawings first on a piece of copy paper, and then I transfer them on to my watercolor paper. That way I don't end up with more pencil marks that I want, and not a lot of erasing happens on the top. The more you erase on top, the more of a chance that you're going to damage your watercolor paper. In that area, I had used a little bit of a gum eraser, and I had erased any area that I thought I wanted to lighten. And I went ahead and I did the lettering right away on that little sign. I didn't want a lot of pencil marks underneath there. I wanted to have more of a true marker look. And once you put watercolor over top of your pencils, it is trapped underneath there. You won't be able to erase it. So if there's an area that you definitely don't want interference of having additional pencil marks, you need to do those first. You need to erase them and get them as light as possible, or even ink it and then erase it as well. So that's why I did my sign first. I'm going to start out my painting by painting my mouse first. This painting has a very limited amount of colors that I'm using for my watercolor. I'm going to be painting her a gray color, so I'm going to be using the color Coal Black in my set. I've watered it down to about tea consistency. That means there's more water, quite a bit more water, and less of my paint inside of there. The reason why I'm doing that is because with watercolor you always start light and then you add your shadows on top. So this is my first layer. I'm painting on dry paper. So by doing that I can keep my paint exactly in the areas that I'm adding them to. If your paper is wet all over, your paint's going to travel wherever your paper is wet. So to allow myself to be able to paint the small illustrative style painting, I'm only going to be working in specific areas, and I'm going to be putting my paint color on dry paper and then adding my layers on top of that. And basically that's all of the steps I'm using when I'm doing the watercolor, by starting light and then adding my shadows. Now with watercolor, you don't necessarily have to darken your color. You could let that dry, so you can put on a layer, let it dry completely, and then add another layer of the color you just put on. But by adding another layer, because this medium is a translucent, transparent material, it's going to show up a little darker. So you get to decide how you want to add your color. You could easily add your color by just adding in another layer of what you just put on, or you could actually add just a little bit more pigment, whatever you think you would like to do. This one I did add a little bit more brown in my gray color as I went, just to warm it up just a little bit. So I added a couple layers on right away. This is a student grade paper, so it dries fairly quick. So I added those layers on first, and then I let them dry, and now I'm adding the pink into the ears. So I just have a light color of the red in my set that I have mixed, and I added just a tiny bit of brown to it just to make it a little bit softer so it wasn't so bright of a shade of red. I could have used pink, but I decided I wanted to try that instead. Now I'm going double time in my film, so I'm not going, I wish I could paint that fast, but I really can't. It takes me a little bit of a while to paint this. Painting at this size usually takes me anywhere from an hour to 2 hours to paint, with all the different drying time as well. Now here I'm figuring out where do I want my shadows, and I know that there's going to be a shadow on her neck, so that's going to be a darker color than what the forefront of her face would be. So I'm going to be adding some shadow underneath her headband and then a little bit down the front of her face as well. In the end, her cheeks will have a lighter feel. They won't be as dark as her face. I'm going to be adding some shadows at the beginning of her ears at the top and adding a little bit darker shadow at the bottom of the ears and trying to just leave a little bit of a highlight in the skinny part of the ears if I can. I'm using the Princeton round brushes for this. I'm using mostly either a 6 or I do have a larger brush, a number 10. And those are the brushes I'm using. I do have some links down inside of my description box if you want to check out some of the items that I like to use, some of my favorite things I've listed down below. And now I mixed up a little bit darker color and I'm adding that as additional color on the part of the front part of her face, coming from the base of her nose, at the top of her nose, and then widening out a little bit across the forehead, just to give it more definition in there and to add more of a contour to her face by adding that little bit of a darker area there. I'm going to be tapping in a little bit more dark, and when I say dark, it's just mostly brown, like a burnt umber color. I'm going to be mixing some of that and then going around her eyes too, to make it look like her eyes are sunk back down instead of just sitting right on top. So I'm adding a little dimension. Now I'm mixing up more of a brighter pink shade here, and I'm going to be adding it to part of my ears, not everywhere. So I'm adding in little strokes here and there, adding a little bit more water, and then having a little bit more of a puddle color there, just a little bit. But then I go back in and clean my brush out, give it a squeeze, and then I can tickle those colors together and soften them as I go. Now I was thinking I wanted this painting to have like a red, a teal, and a pink is what I thought I wanted to do. So I'm mixing up kind of a teal color here. So I'm using like a bright shade of green and more of a shade of Payne's gray, mixing it off to my side. And I keep that puddle of color there, and I will add more to it as I go, and I kind of change up the colors that way. So I was going to be making her dress that color and some of the striping on her outfit as well. But I was going to be leaving that apron on the front, more of a light feeling. So I'm just coming in. This is where it works really great to have a round brush with a nice point on it. The Princeton line does have a great brush for this, and they're not that expensive, and they've lasted me a very long time. I've had them for quite a few years now and painted quite a few paintings with them. But they keep a nice tip on it, and they have a good bounce back. So if you're looking for a reasonably priced brush that does really well for these small paintings, check into the Princeton line. That little set of colors that I'm using there is a student grade color set that I purchased off of Amazon. I use it often because there's some colors in there that I really like that I don't have in my other set. One of them is those pink colors, and there's a peach color in there. There's some blues in there too that I like, but I don't really care for the browns at all. So I use my other set when I want a brown color, but it works well for some of these other areas. This little gal has some interesting, fun little details on her apron, and I made some polka dots, but I'll be adding some colors to those as well. I'm going to be adding some pen work on this at the end, some colored pencils, and like I said, I'm using gouache in the background, so there's a few more layers that are coming, but this is just basically a traditional style of doing watercolor at this section where you lay on your colors light and then you add your shadows as you go. For this week's painting, believe it or not, I was thinking I wanted to do just a pie, but apparently I can't just do a pie. I have to do a mouse, give her an apron, put her in an adorable, cute kitchen. One thing leads to another, which leads to another. If you follow along on my page, you know I love to do these storybook style characters, and this little gal's name is Millie Buttercrumb, and she's going to be on my Ko-fi shop. She'll be available for digital download, so those who like to create with art that's actually made by a human, you can check out my Ko-fi shop, and there is like a small business use license agreement on these little artworks, so you can use it in whatever you create, and you can sell your things as well. She's looking so sweet, and I'm going to get to those eyes in just a moment. I did lose some of the pencil because I had lightened it too much in that area. I'm going to suggest when you're doing these sweet little faces is to leave your pencil marks a little darker around the eyes because I lost where I was going and I really couldn't see them. I thought I was going to be able to just put it back on my light box and retrace my eyes, but I really couldn't see it once I got the watercolor on there. So I had to just kind of wing it and put my lines back in. But I really would like, because those eyes are super cute and I wanted to keep that shape, and I knew I was going to be adding ink pen at the end and I wanted to keep that definition of the eye. I wish I would have done my pencil marks a little bit darker. So in the future, I'm going to be make sure I leave my pencil marks a little bit darker around the eyes so I can see what I'm doing, because I always add a little bit of micron pen to the end anyway. Now these little pennants were fun to use. I had thought I had set them up correctly and had the numbers right, where I was going to have so many of the blue and then some of the plain ones and then the pink. Well, I was one short. I didn't have enough to add an additional pink one, and I couldn't have it off balance. So I ended up figuring out a way to add some more pink pennants up on the top, but I don't like to have things unbalanced. My eyes don't like to look at it, so I had to figure out a way to do it. And I was able to add some in the background on that second string back there, and that worked out okay too. And you can see my colors are starting to darken, and you can tell I really haven't mixed any color darker than what a coffee consistency would be. I like to usually start very light and then add as I go, and I usually add anywhere from 3 to 4 layers of colors on the area and then add my shadows as I'm going. I just find that makes more of a pleasing watercolor look, is to be able to see some of those layers. That's what we all love about watercolor, is seeing those layers. So if we take our time and do them, we're going to have that real pretty look. Well, I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead a little ways. You kind of see the rhythm of how we put watercolor paint on, and that's basically how I'm doing this whole painting, is adding those layers. So I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead to where she's almost done. Now that my mouse was all finished, I was going to be adding the gouache to the background. I wanted a look that was going to be a layered look, so I mixed up a color and I was going to be negative painting around the mouse. I wasn't for certain how much water I needed to add, so I started at this point, but once I did a little bit, I kind of realized I needed to add a little bit more water because I wanted it to have more of a translucent feel. I wanted to have more of that brushed suede, almost a layered look to it. So I like the idea of having more water into it. It doesn't really matter how much water you have into it. You're not really going to break down gouache. It doesn't have a binder in it. It's not a permanent art medium. It's very much like a watercolor where it doesn't have a binder either. In the end, you'll need to either clear coat it with a spray varnish or wax your item to make it all permanent. So I got my first layers on and I was just randomly brushing the colors on, and then I decided, well, it's a little dark on that side, so let's see if I can't lift some of that color. It worked okay. I wouldn't necessarily suggest it, but you can do that if you need to. At this point, I'm still playing and I'm still figuring out how gouache really works. So I've decided that I really want to start with more water when I begin and then build my layers up. Similar to very much like how I do with acrylic paint, I'll add my layers on, and with gouache, you can start dark and layer your lights on. It's just the reverse of what watercolor is. So I'm just building my first layer on. I was a little bit nervous about adding too much water, considering I was using a student grade paper, but it still seemed to hold out quite well. The Canson XL paper held out quite well, even though I did have quite a bit of water in that gouache. It would seem to hold up quite well. Now my gouache hadn't dried, and I had mixed a lighter shade of color, and I wanted to add that to the battens to give it more of a line striped batten look into the background. And it hadn't dried, and I'm just using this white, a lighter color right on the top, even though it's wet. I'm just mixing back and forth, and then now I've decided, well, I want to add another layer on, so I'm going to let it dry just a tiny bit, and I'm going to be adding another layer on. I did get a little messy. I did get some of that paint into the mouse where I didn't really want it. On her cheek specifically, I had a little bit of a spot where I had dragged my hand over, but I was able to take some water, clean my brush off, put it in some water, give it a light squeeze, and I was able to soften that color with using some water, and I really kind of liked the look. So I didn't mind that mistake at all. Some of the areas got a little bit too much into my white. I tried to lift it out. I wasn't able to lift all of the color. It did stain the paper. But because I had white gouache, I was able to go back in, add just a tiny bit of white gouache to kind of glaze over those areas that I had gotten too much on. And I was able to kind of return it back to just a more of a faded white look. It wasn't as bright as what my white paper is, but it worked well. Now in here, I'm mixing this lighter pink, thinking I'd gotten too much coral in, and I would go ahead and layer a layer of pink. And you can do that. You're going to see some of it peeking through. I'm randomly putting that on. This reminds me of doing a mixed media background and layering my acrylic colors on. And I really do enjoy doing that look of this. And this is when I started adding the pink. But then as it dried, because it is a light color, it's going to dry darker. That's a little unusual for quality for gouache. Your dark colors will dry lighter, and your lighter colors will dry darker. Something to keep in mind when you're layering your colors. But I end up putting this layer of pink on pretty much here and there, and when it dries, I think it's too pink, and then that's when I need to change it just a little bit more. So at this stage, I add a little bit more gouache details by adding some of the darker reds into the polka dots. I add a little bit of it into the hearts up above and on that rose and her by her head, just to give it a little bit more oomph in my color. Now this background, I felt like it was a little too pink, but that's all personal preference. You could leave it this way, but when it dried, I just felt like it was a little bit too much strong of a pink color, but I love the way the colors do lay over each other. It gives it more of a opaque feel in my background, which is a nice contrast to the watercolor, and I can get a little bit different dimension using the gouache than what I can with the watercolor. Super fun material to play with, and I'm definitely going to be using it in more projects. I was going to let that gouache background dry completely and see how I might need to tweak my painting. I do go back in and add just a little bit more watercolor in areas and kind of strengthen my line work just a little bit, but I'm going to be using some colored pencils, and I'm going to be able to come in and actually strengthen and straighten my line work with colored pencils as well, and I'm going to be using some micron pen too. So this is where I take off the tape, and then I think, I need to change that background. And I'm going to be adding some gouache onto this even after I take the tape off. I'm going to mix up a little bit of a golden yellow color and then just go in simply and put it over that pink color just to soften it just a little bit. To add the black line work onto my painting, I'm going to be using the micron pen in this nib size 01. I like using that small little nib size to add these tiny little details, and it's a permanent pen once it's dry. So you can even add more product over top, such as watercolor, and you don't have to worry about it smudging once it's dry. To help bring my eyes to life, I'm going to be using some of that black micron pen inside of the eyes. I like to do kind of a scribble look for this too. I like to have it here and there. Now I don't have any open white paper inside of that black area, so I'm going to need to add the catch light or the highlight into my eyes using an ink pen, and I'm going to be using the Jelly Roll pen and the Sequoia one in a 08 nib size to add the little bits of white to her eyes. When I'm doing the outlining, I like to do kind of a scribble hand look. So my lines aren't perfect. I'm stopping, I'm starting, and just doing real irregular lines. And I think that really adds to that hand-drawn look. I'm also going to be using a few color pencils. I like using color pencils when I'm doing watercolor. I can sharpen lines, I can add more colors, I can even add a few more textures that I don't normally have in my watercolor. It's just a nice combination as well. And the XL Canson watercolor paper is slightly smoother, so the color pencils work great over top. And these are the colors that I used when I laid on the next color of gouache. I made sure I added plenty of water this time, and I was able to tint that pink back, but you can still see the pink underneath, but it adds just a really pretty glow to this background. Well, let's take a look at what she looks like sitting in the studio. And here's Miss Millie Buttercrumb sitting amongst some of the other whimsical characters we've painted so far on my YouTube channel. If you enjoy doing this type of art, definitely come over to my channel, check out what I'm doing. I upload new tutorials every week, and I'd love to have more creative friends join me. If you wouldn't mind, give me a thumbs up or leave me a comment. It really does help YouTube push my channel out there and helps me grow my little channel. Well, thanks for joining me, and hopefully you'll come back and join me again. And perhaps next time you'll paint right along with me.